I think when people talk about gender inequality, they focus on the wrong side of the problem. They focus on the gender and they say, since we have gender inequality, we need to get rid of gender. I think we need to get rid of the inequality. You will never get rid of gender, and sex differences is just an impossibility because we are a biological species. But inequality is something we can tackle.
So I just finished your book, and before we get into your new book, Different: Gender Through the Eyes of a Primatologist, I want to take a step back and ask you, so you've had a lengthy career, you're very world-renowned in your field and broadly as a biologist, and I want to ask you, why primatology? There's a specific reason I asked that. Reading your book, I understood, you're drawn to animals from a young age. And things like that. But when I read your writings, I see like a poetic sense to the way you write, and you look at the world very broadly. You invoke philosophy and religion and science and art. But your primary research is in primatology. So I'd like to ask you, what's the motivation there?
That's a sort of accident. I was always interested in animals. I would probably have been happy with birds. I love fish, for example. Since very young I've had fish. I've never been without a fish tank in my life. So I love animals, but by accident I ended up in the primates. And I really liked chimpanzees when I first got to know them. It's a difficult animal to work with because it's a dangerous animal. It's much stronger than we are, and very volatile. But it's a fascinating. In mind it's so close to us. And in the whole psychology, the chimpanzee is so close to us that it's a fascinating species. And so I fell in love with the primates at some point. And since I like popularizing things, the primates make it easier, of course, because to extrapolate from the primates to us, we are also primates, is not so difficult.
Right. As a layman, sort of looking into all this, I feel as though people often look to that literature or that research to sort of invoke something about ourselves, right? This idea that they're our closest relative or closest ancestor, primates, specifically chimpanzees. And in your book, you go on to popularize the idea that bonobos are also akin to us on a DNA level. We'll get into that in just a second. You've done lots of different sects of research within primatology, and you've landed on gender as your current sort of field of study or inquiry at the moment. What's the motivation to study gender right now in this time?
If you work on social behavior, as I've done all my life, you always run into sex differences. That's inevitable. And I've never paid so much attention to them, even though every primatologist is completely familiar with them. But I notice that each time I talk with general audiences about my work, whether it's about intelligence or emotions or whatever it is, people zoom in on the sex differences. And that is, I think there's a great curiosity at the moment in society about what is the biology of gender differences. We all hear constantly about the cultural side and how everything is due to education and socialization, but I think many people are skeptical about that, and because they have had boys and girls at home, for example, and they've noticed some differences that I think they believe are biological. So they want to hear from me as a primatologist what I think of that,
I mean, that's largely in part why I was so interested to talk to you. You speak of a number of things, but I think right now you're hitting a real key in the culture there. It seems like everything is sort of being overly attributed to socialization and culture and education and this top-down, like we all of our behavior is learned. And I guess that's where I kind of want to pick off with you in terms of talking about your book. So in your experience with primates, and I guess we can broaden that out to humans, are our behaviors more or less learned, or is there reason to think that some of these behaviors are biologically based?
Yeah, so the claim that things are socialized. As soon as you say, for example, girls are more empathic than boys, they say, oh yeah, that's because we socialize them that way. That is said usually without any evidence. I've never seen really studies that pin down where these differences come from. So I would like an evidence-based approach to gender differences.
Right.
And one of the ways for me to look at that is that which differences are universal in the human species, all societies, which differences do we share with other primates, and which differences emerge so early in life that socialization and culture is probably, in the first couple of months, there's probably no effect of them. And there are a few differences that then remain. So, for example, a universal difference is that men are more violent than women. All homicide statistics in all countries indicate that. Men are more physically violent than women. So then, and since in the primates, males are more violent than females physically, that's something you need to take into account. It's very unlikely that that's purely a cultural product. And so that's how I go about pinpointing differences. Even though I must say there's also differences that we often postulate in human society that I cannot find and that I don't find much support for. For example, people will say men are more hierarchical than women. I don't think we have any evidence for that. Certainly not in the primates. All the primates have female hierarchies and pecking orders, and in human, the tests that are done by social psychologists don't indicate that men are more hierarchical than women. So that's a standpoint that people have, apparently. I don't know where it comes from, that is not supported.
So this idea of hierarchy, I'm going to speak as a layman here. I mean, I've read your book, but that's about my exposure to primatology and some of your other works as well. So coming into this field, I would have held that belief that, males operate in sort of a hierarchy, and maybe females operate more in egalitarian sort of circles or ways, at least among humans. And I would say in part my ideas of that are partly informed from what I understood about primates. And in your book, you really emphasize the idea that we were sort of sold this idea about chimpanzees and survival of the fittest, and there's this alpha male, and he sort of bullies everyone into submission. And I was really surprised to read that from you, because you draw a stark contrast to bonobos, whom you use to sort of illustrate the idea that maybe this idea of hierarchy is unfounded. If you could speak to that, because I think the broader public probably has the same perception that I did coming into this.
Yeah, as soon as you put young puppies together, or young goslings, or human toddlers in a daycare center, you put them together the first day, they're going to beat up on each other to see who's dominant. That's a general pattern. It's not different by the sexes, even though the hierarchies are usually segregated. There's usually a male hierarchy and a female hierarchy. The males care about their position among the males and the females among the females. Between them, it's a very different issue. So, but hierarchies, the word pecking order comes from hens, not from roosters. And hierarchies are found in all the social female animals that I know, and in male animals. And yeah, people have a wrong idea. For example, they have the idea that the alpha male is a bully and beats up everybody. But, the alpha male can be a very responsible leader, can be someone who keeps the peace in the group and keeps the unity in the group. And alpha males can be extremely popular as a result, because they defend the underdog in the group. And so, yes, you have bullies. Also in chimpanzees, you have bully alpha males. They often don't end very well, because the group gets fed up at some point by their behavior. And you have alpha females. In every group of primates you have an alpha female. They can be sometimes very powerful. I described in my previous book Mama, the chimpanzee, who basically decided which male was going to be alpha male. So then you wonder, who's the most powerful? Is it the alpha male or the female who decides who's going to be alpha male? So I have a very different opinion. In the experiments that have been done with humans, there's a social psychologist who has created groups of humans of same gender. So she would put 5 women in a room or 5 men in a room, and she would give them a task to decide something together.
Okay.
And she would measure who interrupts whom in the discussion. So if I constantly interrupting you, I must be dominant. That's how she measured dominance. And she found that the men form a rank order more quickly, almost immediately. They're very quick in that. The women take more time, but always end up with a rank order also. Yeah.
So what is the female rank order predicated on? Because I imagine like speaking as a man, like who works with other males and things like that, I would imagine it's physical prowess is probably an indicator or something that's used to determine rank order, like physical strength and competency. I would imagine the person that's most competent was probably be higher up in rank order. So are these, you're saying that when a group of females operate together, they also form this rank order. But are they predicated on the same things that a male hierarchy would be?
Yeah, I can answer this for the primates. For humans, we have less evidence, and that's because in psychology they are afraid of dominance and rank orders. Okay. So even we're now sitting here on the campus of Emory University, even though every university has a hierarchy, going down from the president to the provost to the deans to the professors to the undergraduate students. We have this enormous hierarchy, but psychologists act as if we are an egalitarian species, and they do very little research on that. But in the primates, I can be very clear because that has been studied. I would say that the female hierarchy is largely based on personality and age. So, for example, Mama, the chimpanzee, who was alpha female for 40 years, she was still alpha female when she could barely walk anymore and was blind. She died she was almost 60 when she died. And that would never happen among the males. Among the males, physical prowess is important. It is not the most important part, because a small male can be alpha male. But males would, if an individual starts to wobble or get blind, they would take advantage of that and kick them out of the position. In the females, no. Females, age is an advantage, and we know that also from the wild chimpanzees. We know that older females tend to dominate younger females. So age is an advantage, and personality, and I find that very hard to define, but some females have a much more assertive personality than other females.
And that's viewed as attractive?
Oh yes, an alpha female can be extremely attractive because she becomes then the center of the females, even though they also have to obey her. So it's not benign necessarily. So for example, Mama, she would beat up other females if they did not do what she wanted. So for example, if they supported the wrong male in the male power struggles, she would beat them up. So it's not necessarily a nice dominance, but it's less physically expressed also than among the males. Among the males, physical strength is important, and we still see that in humans. We still see that in, for example, presidential elections in the US, the taller men have advantages over shorter men. Right. We know that. And there are psychologists who have done studies on where they show pictures of men and they manipulate how tall they are by the background items they put next to them. And a taller man is seen more as a leader than a shorter man. And for women, size doesn't matter. It's not an issue.
I would say, so you're saying in primate communities, the physical prowess of a female has virtually no bearing on her status in the group, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say that would be relatively akin to us humans. I think females are judged on physical appearances that have less to do with physical prowess. Maybe they lean more towards beauty and these things, like those type of superficial things, whereas men, like the breadth of your shoulders.
But I think for leadership,
strength.
Beauty doesn't. I've never heard that beauty matters. Matters
fair.
Much.
Fair.
For other issues, yeah, between the sexes especially, it's gonna matter, of course. But I think if you're team building, men and women, the beauty of women is not the main issue there. Yeah.
I think. So I wanna pry at this a little bit. So the female alpha, the alpha female. Does she anyway glean take status from the alpha male? Like, is that how she earns her status, or it's strictly it's a solo endeavor? She's responsible for the group on her own accord and her own merit.
No, because the hierarchies are mostly segregated. Most of the competition in a primate society, and I would say the same in human society, is between members of the same gender. Men compete with men, women with women. And the same is true in the primate societies. The dominance relation between the sexes is a sort of different issue, and it's not that important to them. So, for example, in bonobos, the females are dominant over the males. I don't think the males worry much about that. The males worry about where they stand among the males. Whether the females dominate them or not is a sort of secondary issue to them. And I would say that's true for almost all primate societies. And so if a female is alpha, like Mama the chimpanzee, she's alpha on her own among the females. What happens with the males is a sort of different issue. And in the bonobos, the females are collectively dominant over the males. The females are smaller than the males, so they cannot individually physically dominate the male, but collectively the females have managed to become dominant in bonobo society, and the alpha female is alpha over everyone. And yes, in this case, for example, in the bonobos, the females have an effect on the male hierarchy. So the high-ranking males are usually the sons of the high-ranking females. That's a general rule, yeah.
So there's a bit of a kinship there.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of when you look at the male predicated chimpanzee hierarchy and then the female predicated bonobo hierarchy, what are the advantages to one strategy or the other? Because they're such close descendants or ancestors of ours.
Yeah.
Speaking in your book, you mentioned that on a DNA level, we're equally as close to chimpanzees and bonobos, but we've been sold the idea that we're so much more close to chimpanzees than any other primate.
That is due to the anthropologists not being happy with the bonobo. The anthropologists were very happy when the chimp came along because they have a scenario of human evolution where we became the dominant force in the world because we eliminated everybody else and we conquered the earth. And so they have a sort of war and hunting focused approach to human evolution. And the bonobo didn't fit. The bonobo is peaceful, female dominated, very sexy. And and Americans are very prudish, and so the erotic part of the bonobos they didn't want to talk about.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by sexy? Because that's not what I think of when I think of a...
The bonobos have a lot of sex to regulate their society. So I would say 3/4 of their sexual activity has nothing to do with reproduction. Has to do with either pleasure or social relations or reconciling after fights or dividing the food and sharing the food, and then they have sex about it, So the bonobos are a very erotic species, and that was not very welcome in the anthropological scenarios.
Okay.
So the bonobo was not popular, and so they focused on the chimpanzee because chimpanzees kill each other between groups. The males are dominant, the males are very violent, and that fits so much more easily with their scenarios than the bonobo. Even though I think the bonobo is extremely important, and I'm so glad we have the two species, chimpanzees and bonobos. Bonobos have a lot of female bonding, and I would say human society has lots of female bonding. So there's a big parallel there that is overlooked if we only focus on the males.
So what element of that story do you feel is neglected? Because I feel as though we can understand how male-to-male relations, maybe primates, how they relate to each other. But you mentioned this idea of female bonding among bonobos specifically. So what's that element of the story that we're missing among primates? And then you said it translates into humans as well, or we can glean a bit of information from that.
Well, the female bonding of the bonobos, I think, is partly a strategy against male violence. In chimpanzees, males cause trouble for females sometimes. Even though most of their violence is male to male, they do direct it at females, especially in sexual context. And sometimes they direct it at their children when they are infanticidal, so they kill sometimes infants. And so that's a big problem for the female chimpanzee, which is reduced when females are together. So in captivity, I've always worked at zoos with chimpanzees. In captivity, the females are together and they help each other against males. And the males have to restrain that kind of behavior. That's not accepted by the females. And then the bonobo has gone one step further. The bonobo females are almost always together. They travel together. They do things together. They're very bonded. And they have put a stop to all of it by dominating the males. So collectively they dominate the males. As a result, there's no infanticide in bonobo society. There's no rape in their society. There's no sexual violence by males. So it's a sort of Me Too movement by the females that is extremely effective. And I think that's the advantage of the bonobo society, especially for the females. Yeah.
I think that's so compelling because I feel like there's striking comparisons to our human society in terms of that gender difference that you're describing in the relations between intra like sexual dynamics. Like a funny example, like I always joke that like women will never go to the washroom alone, right? They'll always go with a pair. And part of that, it seems humorous, but there's an element of ensuring safety that way.
Yeah, it's probably a safety measure. That's what I guess.
Right, and that's just anecdotal, and I think I think that's funny to see that that's how the problem of like infanticide is solved in the primate community is through this female bonding behavior. I think that's quite interesting. I want to jump to sort of the general theme of your book, because I feel like you try to push back against a lot of sort of new ideas and culture that are coming up. I wish I had done this at the beginning of our conversation, but you're a biologist broadly, primatologist more specifically. So when you look at things, I really like the way you describe it, that you say in science you're not here to judge what you're studying, but you're here to simply observe. And I think the broader public, they're quick to judgment, and it's hard to remove that emotional element when you look at facts. So if you could define for me what is sex, what is gender, and then what is gender identity, and I think from there we can kind of go off in a bit of a different direction.
Sex I usually use for the biological side of things. There are two sexes. It's binary. Although not 100%, it's let's say 98% binary, males and females, and that is true for so many species. Not for, there's species that are exceptional, but in the primates that's the typical pattern. And that relates to chromosomes and genitals and hormones and brains, basically how the size difference between the sexes, so that sexual dimorphism we call that. Then the genders, I usually don't define gender by male or female, but more masculine and feminine. It's the way you express yourself and how you have been taught to express yourself, how you have been taught to behave as a man or as a boy or as a woman or a girl. And so that's a cultural thing. It's variable from country to country, it's variable over time, and gender expression is much more flexible. And is a cultural phenomenon, and I argue in my book that the same applies to other primates, that they also have genders, because, for example, a chimpanzee or bonobo is adult when they're 16, so they have a very slow development. They learn a lot of things in their life, including, I think, how males behave and how females behave. So gender is a concept that I can apply to other primates as well. And then you ask about gender identity. You have sexual orientation, that is what you are attracted to, individuals of the same sex or the opposite sex, and then you have identity, which is what you feel you are. Are you, and that's mostly divided in male and female. Do you feel you are a man or do you feel you are a woman? And gender identity is also a biological phenomenon, I think, because it arises very early in life. Most of the cases, like at 3-4 years of age, it is expressed, and it's irreversible. I think there was a recent American study that showed that only 2.5% of the children who say that they are transgender change their mind 6 years later. Well, that's extremely low, 2.5%. That means that they're very persistent in what they think, and the society, of course, tries to change their mind. Society, let's say you're born as a boy, and you say you're actually a girl, society is going to resist, but they keep going, which means it must come from inside. It's not something, they're under pressure, and they still maintain that position. So I think it's a biological thing.
Right. Yeah. I'm glad you clarified all of that, and you specified the position that while I'm going to quote your definition of gender, because I thought it was really interesting. You said gender refers to the learned cultural overlays of a biological male into a man and the learned cultural overlays of a female into a woman. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. But then they stretch that out so far to believe that everything's sort of a top-down programming, and there's no biological basis. For sex, sure, you could make the argument of chromosomes or gametes, whatever your natal sex is. But then when it comes to gender, they think that's like a free-for-all type of decision that one makes. And I guess the expression of your gender is a decision you make. But can you describe some of those biological bases for gender specifically that you're arguing?
Yeah, so the reason we have a gender duality is because we have two sexes. I don't think we would have genders if we had no sexes. If
Right.
we were a cloning species, where that means that you have no genitals, we have no sex differences, we all look exactly the same because we're cloning, no one would have come up with the gender concept, and there would be no genders, I'm sure. So genders remain connected to the sexes, even though they are a bit free floating. They're a little bit independent, but not so independent that you can say I'm going to be sex neutral. I'm going to be without gender. It is going to be a very tough position to maintain, especially when you reach puberty and all your sexual interests are aroused. I think it's a very difficult position to maintain. So I don't believe that gender can be uncoupled from sex, even though it has a bit of an independence in how things are expressed. Yeah.
Right. I from reading your book, you outlined like some of the consequences of just doing away with the concept of gender at all, and you're touching upon it here. This idea that like the most profound thing in life, you know, we study science, like profound, yes, of course, but like love, like just such a like a simple concept, but it's kind of the end of all things to some degree. And if you take gender out of the equation, it kind of complicates one of our most fundamental drives there. So I thought that was a compelling argument. It's quite interesting there. Just to rewind a second there. So what are some of these biological indicators that we have like a biologically predetermined gender? Because you go on in your book to talk about some literature around toy preferences. You go on to talk about this idea of like self-socialization. So you could speak to some of that. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think since children very early have a certain gender identity, we're all born with a gender identity. Maybe there's a few without it, but I think most children either identify as a male or as a female. And then you have trans children who are born as one sex but identify with the other gender. And that happens also very early in life. And I think the self-socialization occurs by focusing on adult individuals of the gender you think you are. So a typical child born as a girl will identify with her mother and copy everything that her mother is doing because that's an adult female who is around. And a young boy will do that with his father. And in primate groups, we see the same processes. Young females pay a lot of attention to their mothers. Young males pay a lot of attention to adult males who are around. For example, there was a recent orangutan study that showed that young females, they eat exactly the same diet of foods as their mother. You know, there's hundreds of plants and fruits out in the forest. They eat exactly what their mother is eating. Whereas young males, they eat different things, probably because they're watching adult males who come by and eat different things. And so that self-socialization applies also to the primates. And what happens in trans children is that they identify with adults of the opposite sex that they're born with. So let's say you're born as a boy, you identify as a girl, you're going to be emulating adult women, like your mother, to adopt them as role models, so to speak. And that's a theory that comes from Joan Roughgarden, who's a biologist, but who's also a trans woman, and who has developed this idea that trans children self-socialize this way.
Okay. So you see that self-socialization in primates. I think there's definitely reason to believe that a similar process occurs in human children as well. In your book, you kind of you talk about you use Sweden, I think, as an example of a country where there's supposedly like a top-down aim to promote this idea of equality, and we'll get to the idea of equality in a second. I think that's another fundamental theme that you argue in favor of, but in different ways. That some of these ideas, like no matter how much or in what ways you try to enforce them, there is this biological predisposition for certain interests to reflect in children.
Yeah, so in Sweden they looked at the toys of the boys and the girls, and they went into the rooms of them and they cataloged all their toys, thinking that in Sweden maybe there would be less of a difference between boys and girls in the toys that they choose. But it was exactly the same as everywhere else. The boys have tools and cars and trucks and sports equipment, and the girls have household items and dresses and cooking equipment and stuff like that. And so they and dolls, of course. And so they found the same differences, and actually there are studies that indicate that the opinion of the parents about gender has basically no effect on the toy choices of the children. Now there's of course always exceptional children. There's always certain children, girls who like trucks, and there's certain boys who like dolls. But if you look at the other primates, you see the same difference. And so especially the doll preference. The trucks, you know, they have tried that out on monkeys. They have given them trucks and cars, and it's the males who picked them up. But I have no idea personally what that means for a monkey. You know, a monkey has no connection with trucks, of course. But dolls is different, because dolls resemble young primates or young animals, and the females will pick them up in generally, not the males. The males are not interested. And also, if a mother monkey arrives with a newborn baby in a group of monkeys, she's going to be surrounded by young females. The young females want to touch the baby and hold the baby. And the young males are usually not there. And when these young females get older, they're going to be trusted by the mother. And the mother is going to use them as babysitters. She will leave the baby with them sometimes. And so the interest of young females in infants and newborns and dolls is, I think, a universal primate characteristic. There's even observations in the wild of chimpanzee females picking up wooden logs or rocks and holding them on their belly and on their back and carrying them around as if they have a baby. So if they don't have dolls, they make dolls, so to speak. So that's a very old tendency, and it relates to maternity training. It relates to young females needing experience. It's very one of the toughest jobs for a primate is to raise a kid. And so people underestimate that. They think that's all instinct, maternal instinct.
Right.
It's actually a very difficult skill. So if, let's say you're a gorilla female and you have a baby, the baby is in your lap, how does that baby get to your nipple? It doesn't get there by itself. That's quite a climb, and the baby doesn't know where to go. And so the mother needs to bring that baby to her nipple, and she needs to understand that that's where the baby belongs, and not be frightened by the baby latching on, which may be painful. And so the female needs to have a lot of knowledge before she can do that. And that knowledge usually comes from other females who've had babies. So they need to learn how to care for babies. And that's why at zoos, if they have a bunch of gorillas and they've never had any babies, and let's say one of the females is pregnant, the zoos know that. And they bring usually a human mother in who's going to nurse her baby in front of the gorillas. And she will do that every day for a couple of weeks. And the zoo hopes, and sometimes that works, that the young female will pick up on that.
That's strikingly similar to sort of how human mothers would sort of operate, like new mothers, right? Kind of rely on like the matriarchy or community of women.
There's an enormous transmission of knowledge going on there.
Yeah.
And the same is true in primate societies, and we now have even studies on mice. That young virgin mice, they call it, mice who have never had a baby, need to learn how to carry pups and what to do with them. Yeah.
Oh wow! So this is very basal. In terms of.
Yeah. So we speak of the maternal instinct. I would say the only thing that's instinctive is maybe the attraction to newborns, being attracted to them, but all the rest needs to be learned. Yeah.
Okay, so you at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that there was like sort of three ways that you can look at sex differences. In primates, you could look at it so early on in human development that the influence of culture probably doesn't get in. So you mentioned the toy preferences that are consistent among primates and human children, which I think is interesting. Is there a cross-cultural evidence of biological predispositions for gender? Is there cross-cultural evidence for that?
Well, for these child behaviors, yes. There's actually not many studies, but there is a study that compared, I believe, 10 different cultures, very different places, on how boys and girls are raised and what they do. And yes, the girls are much more involved in all these cultures in childcare and babysitting than the boys are. And another universal difference is that boys like to wrestle, roughhousing. So
Right.
mock fighting is in all the primates, the males do that more than females. And in all human societies and all studies that I know of child development, many actually done in Canada. I know you come from Canada.
Yes.
So many of these studies were done, and boys do a lot more wrestling than girls. And the thinking is, in fact, why are children usually segregated in play groups, like the girls play with girls and the boys play with boys, which is also true, by the way, for many of the primates. Why is that? And we think it is because the boys are too rough in their play. They like to wrestle, and the girls just don't want to engage in that. That's not their kind of play. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a self-serving mechanism, like a young female chimpanzee could get hurt in that rough and tumble play, presumably, because
I'm not sure she's worried to get hurt, but it doesn't attract her at all. And so it is interesting. I mentioned in my book a female named Donna, a female chimp, who at a very young age wanted to wrestle. That was for us a surprise, and for the male chimpanzees it was a surprise.
Right.
And for me, because he liked to wrestle with me too. And so she was a wrestler. And from very early on, and we thought it was odd, but it was not disturbing. And the male chimpanzees, the alpha male, did wrestle with her quite a bit. And then she grew in adolescence, that's 12 years later or so. She grew into a male-like character. She developed the long hair and the big shoulders and the big head and the big hands. And she started to walk like a male. And so from a distance, she looked like a male, and she associated a lot with the males. And she would, the display behavior, the males do a lot of intimidation behavior. She would do that along with them. And so she became a male-like character. And she never had children. She was not interested in sex with males or with females. And I sometimes think that she may have had a different gender identity. I cannot ask her that, of course.
Right.
But she may have identified more like a male than like a female. Yeah.
So would the other males in the group of chimpanzees have received her as male? Is like that's how they would interact with her? Because I imagine the intersexual dynamics between male and females are a certain way, but you're saying that this particular chimpanzee was hyper masculine for a female. Yeah. So how was she received by everyone else?
She was extremely well integrated. The males, since she did not compete with them, she did not try to become a dominant male or something. She acted along with them, and she associated with them, but she was not trying to take a position, a higher-ranking position there. The males didn't particularly care, and the females didn't particularly care, I must say. She was extremely well integrated, and this is sort of the history of all the cases that I know, because I've also known individuals who are more homosexual than heterosexual. I've also known males who don't play the macho game, and don't act like a male, basically. All these individuals are well integrated usually. I've never noticed that they are rejected. And so I make that point is that we humans, we are very much pigeonholing. We like to put everyone in a little box, and you say you are a male and you're a female and don't get out of this box. The chimpanzees don't do that. They are not a symbolic species, meaning that they don't put labels on everything.
Okay.
And we are labeling. We're always labeling everything. And if you don't fit a label, then we have trouble with you,
Right. There's very much so an in-group, out-group behavior that's so fundamental to human behavior. But I find that very striking that an animal that operates so out of her perceived gender role is so well received on both sides. So I think that's a very interesting case there. You were mentioning that so Donna, being the outlier, she would engage in rough and tumble play and all of these things that are more masculine. But generally, female primates don't find any interest in this. And I think you mentioned in your book that there's a biological basis for that. In the brain, there's an area that provides a reward for that type of behavior, but that's gender specific. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, the thinking is that the self-socialization, where young males try to act like adult males and young females try to act like the adult females around them, that's a biological process, that we are basically biologically programmed to learn our gender roles from models around us. I compare it with imprinting of ducks and geese.
Right.
So a young duckling is pre-programmed to learn something about moving objects. The first moving object that they see is they're going to follow, and they're going to identify with, and that will be their species. And if that is if that's their mom, she's fine. She's going to learn to be a duck, so to speak. But if that's a biologist, which Conrad Lorenz did, of course, with his ducks and geese, if they're following an adult man, they're later going to identify as human, and they're going to be sexually attracted to humans and so on. So that's a learning, we call it a learning predisposition. A learning predisposition is a biological program to learn something at a specific time in your life. And imprinting is an example. Language learning is another example. We humans, we learn language very easily when we're very young, very difficult for us when we're older, when we're over 15 or something. And so we have a learning predisposition for language. And I think we also have a learning predisposition for gender. From very young, we identify with a certain gender, and we're going to emulate the adults that we see around us. And that's how we get the gender roles that we have. And that's why gender is also a concept that we can apply to other primates.
I think that's definitely true among human societies as well, where for the majority of people, they can probably relate to that experience. They're a particular sex, and then they have a same-sex parent, and then that's their imprint or model for their behavior. In cross-culturally, there have been different societies that have like third genders, and there's people who claim to be agender or gender fluid and all of these things. Is there any similar instances that you've seen in your work with primates of similar behaviors, or I guess gender identities wouldn't be the right word because you can't ask them, but any similar behaviors or displays?
Yes, third gender, that often may relate to intersex people who are ambiguous in whether they're male or female. I used to think that I was very open-minded to have a label for third gender, and that was wonderful to have that, but then I read an article about India where they have that label, that these people are not treated very well. So then you have a label for them, and that's all wonderful.
Okay.
But you're not really accepting them very well in society.
So is it the category that's not valid, or is it just they're excluded and it's society's problem?
They're not excluded. They're included in society, but they're not treated with a lot of respect. So maybe there are societies where they do that, and that would be great. I'm always looking for these examples of acceptance, but the history, of course, of the large human societies at least, is a lot of intolerance. So, for example, when I came to the U.S., I'm from Holland. In the Netherlands, homosexual behavior has been legal for more than 2 centuries. And so we never really discuss it as something that is problematic. So when I came to the US, I had to fill out a piece of paper as an immigrant that I was not a communist and I was not a homosexual.
What year was this?
And that was in 1980, I think, or 1981. Okay. So I was astonished that I had to tell them that I was not a homosexual, as if that was a major issue. And they abolished that in the 1990s, I believe, but still, that was the attitude at the time, and I had to get used to that they made these distinctions.
Wow. That wasn't that long ago when you think about that. Going back to primates, do you see the same type of stigma surrounding, let's say, same-sex relationships or same-sex sexual behavior among primates?
No, absolutely not. So first of all, in the bonobos, female sex is probably the most common sex. And so in the bonobos, I would call them perfectly bisexual because they have sex in all combinations that you can imagine. But then in other primate species, homosexual behavior is less common than heterosexual behavior usually. But there's absolutely no stigma attached to it. There's nothing negative about it. And I don't see individuals... Well, there may be individuals who reject it, who don't want to participate in it. That may happen. But I don't see that it attaches to the individual as a negative label or something.
Okay. I'm going to use an example that I see in human society, and I want to see what we can infer from our primate relatives. So among men and women, I've specifically noticed that it's a lot more taboo, or there's more stigma around a man doing things that are more feminine or engaging in homosexual-esque behavior than to say, like, if two women were holding hands, you would bat an eye at it. And there's this...
although you know that there are societies like Indonesia,
right,
where men hold hands all the time. They walk the streets holding hands. So
fair.
So I think that's culturally variable, you know?
Fair. So what I'm getting at here is that so males, you said that they can or may or may not participate in homosexual behavior. Is that indicative of their masculinity? Like, will the alpha male display any sort of homosexual behavior, or no?
Yeah, I don't think that has to do much with the masculinity. I don't know why we are intolerant in human society of homosexual behavior. And you're right, it's especially male to male more than female to female. It's maybe because male to male is more visible. I don't know, but many men feel sort of it undermines their masculinity to have men like that around. Even though one of the scientists who studied the neuroscience of homosexuality, he said actually heterosexual men should be happy that they're homosexual men because they're not in competition with them. They should be happy about it. Yeah, that seems a very logical argument to me.
Fair.
From an evolutionary perspective. So I've never understood why that is a big deal, but it is for some men a big deal. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a specifically human problem, or stigma.
Well, I think it's very Western, and I would even say in the U.S. it's stronger because manliness is so highly valued. You know, liking sports and red meat and guns, which is an attitude that I absolutely don't understand. But that kind of masculinity is maybe threatened by homosexual people. And other societies are less dramatic in their gender differences than that. Yeah.
Okay, so these sort of markers of masculinity that you're naming, perhaps they're useful signals for females that this male is displaying high qualities of masculinity. They would be a good protector, provider. That sort of thing?
I think women are sensitive to that. So the studies that show, for example, at tallness, how tall are men and how tall are women, show that women prefer tall men taller than themselves, more strongly than men prefer women who are shorter than themselves. So the size difference between men and women is more driven by women wanting tall men than the opposite. And that probably has to do with a protector role. In a society where men are potentially dangerous, it is good for a woman to walk the street with a man who can hold his ground, you know?
Fair.
Yeah.
So I imagine that sexual dimorphism as it's presented in mammals, and specifically chimpanzees, I would imagine that the ones with greater physical prowess have greater ability to attract females. To
some degree, because in chimpanzees, the smallest male can become the alpha male.
So how does that happen? You mentioned that.
And that is because it is based on coalitions. So it's a political system. My first book was Chimpanzee Politics.
Right.
The males form coalitions, and as a result, to become an alpha male, you need some buddies who support you, and it's also good to have female support. So you need some diplomatic skills to get there, and if you are a loner, you may get to the top purely based on your physical strengths, and that's sometimes why these bullies come to the top, and they are hyper aggressive. But most alpha males that I have known get there by a political process where they have buddies who support them, and they need to keep them happy. So they need to be tolerant to them. They need to let them mate with females. They need to share food with them. They need to groom them, and that's how they keep them as friends.
That is so interesting. So they're doing what we would attribute as human-like qualities. They're very charismatic. They're generous, selfless, responsible.
Yeah.
And that's how they elevate the male hierarchy. And actually, so in your experience with primates, would you say the bully tactic is less favorable to this sort of charisma, likable fella?
Yeah, the bully tactic. There are reports from the wild. There are now about 12 reports, I believe, of alpha males who have been killed by their group in chimpanzees. And I think if you're a bully alpha male, then the group is basically waiting for an occasion. There will be a challenger, a younger male who challenges you, and the group is ready to get rid of you. And then they support the challenger, and it may be dangerous for you. They may either expel you to the fringes of their territory, or they may kill an individual like that. And in captivity that happens also sometimes. And the really popular leaders, so alpha males who are popular in the group, when they lose their position, they just step down a few rungs and they become number 3 male or number 4 male, and they stay in the group, and they become popular grandpas for the kids and things like that. And so they have a good life. They're not at the top anymore. And young males, actually, there's now a report from the wild. Adolescent males, they like to hang out with these older guys. They probably pick up good behavior from them, and so these ex-leaders and ex-alphas, they hang out with them.
The younger males like to associate with these former alpha males.
Yeah, because they are not dangerous. They're not into competition. They're not going to beat them up, and so they are good objects for them to hang out with.
That's so interesting. It's like that fatherly wisdom that they can sort of pass down, or like a grandpa type role from the older males there. That's really cool. You just to take a couple steps back, you were talking about sort of Western attitudes towards gender and things like that. You're from the Netherlands, and you illustrated a couple of examples of how like Western society is maybe overly sexualized, or they have particular stigmas around gender. And you coined the term, which I find funny, lactation room.
Yeah.
And
do you have those in Toronto?
Yeah, we do.
You do?
Yeah.
When I first saw the lactation room here in the department that you just saw, people were very proud of it, and I thought it was a disaster. I thought it's a shame that we have to have a lactation room, because why do we have them? We have them because women cannot breastfeed in public, and because women have no maternity leaves. So in civilized society, as I would call it, in Northern Europe, women have at least half a year, that's typical, or sometimes longer, but at least half a year maternity leave. We also have paternity leaves nowadays. And so the need to pump milk or to breastfeed in a public space is actually not there. But if they want to do that, they can sit here right in front of me in a chair and breastfeed their baby right in public. I see that in the Netherlands regularly. And no one is shocked by it, and everyone thinks it's a wonderful scene. But here, I think a lactation room is actually a defeat. It's actually you've lost the battle for public breastfeeding. Yeah.
I have to admit, I'm born and raised a Westerner, so the idea of women just sitting around breastfeeding publicly is beyond me. It's not something I grew up with. I'm not saying I'm for or against it. I just thought your stance on it was interesting, that you were so profoundly confused by it or upset by it.
Well, I do see the advantage in this society, because before that, of course, women would need to go into the bathroom to do that, which is the worst possible place, and so I do understand that they wanted to have a little bit of an improvement there, but it's sad that we cannot have a completely natural activity that is non-sexual, in my opinion, in public.
Well, I think you make an interesting point in your book as to why that behavior might be sexualized, and it like to do with breasts in mammals. Mm-hmm. The idea you mentioned that in humans the breast stays swollen, whereas in other mammals the breast will return to.
Yeah, so humans migrated a lot of the sexual signals that other primates have on their butt, so to speak, or between their legs or on their back.
Sure.
We migrated that to the front. And so our face became genderized. So you can... people have done that. You can present people with pictures of human faces, and you block out all the hair and all the makeup, and you just see the face. And within a second, you can, with almost 100% accuracy, say this is a man or this is a woman. So we're very good at that, at classifying faces. And so the face has become a gender signal post, and we enhance that with makeup and hair and all of that. And then the breasts are maybe part of that, is that we moved signals from the behind to the front. And so that's maybe why breasts have become sexualized, even though I must also say that there are also societies where they have absolutely no sexual significance, and that's why you see bare-breasted women walking around in them. Yeah.
So there is evidence to suggest that there might be a biological basis for the uneasiness, let's say, around that conversation, but clearly where you're from, it works, and it can be unsexualized, if you will.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, staying on that sort of same vein, like there's a few nuanced conversations that are taking place in society around gender, and I want to ask you: is there a biological basis for manspreading?
Manspreading. Well, in all the primates, the males like to spread their legs.
Sure.
Especially the dominant males. And actually in humans, I've seen a picture recently of the White House. I think it was during Reagan's time, where you had a whole bunch of men. There was no women, I believe. A whole bunch of men sitting there, all with their legs wide apart. So all acting very dominant. So in the primates, a male who sits with his legs apart, showing his testicles, that's a sign that he's a high-ranking male. And some male primates do it all the time and have even differently colored testicles for that purpose. So there's some monkeys who have blue testicles or purple testicles, so that if they spread their legs, it's a very clear signal. And it's a bit an intimidation signal, like look at how self-confident I am, and a sort of advertisement also.
Is that an intrasexual display or an intersexual display?
I think it's both. It's showing to other males that you are high-ranking, and it's a signal to the females. That of course doesn't excuse men in the bus to do the manspreading and stuff like that, or to take up more space than they need. But I think it's a fairly natural tendency.
Well, I think it is true, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the literature might support this. The idea that men who are depicted taking up more space in public spaces are looked upon favorably by women.
Yeah. There was a Tinder study where they did sort of. They showed pictures of men who were either folded a little bit, so making themselves look small, or men who were sitting wide with their legs apart and arms apart, and the women went more for the men who did the latter thing. Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps there's a biological basis for that behavior, but there's not a biological basis to being obnoxious.
Yeah, no.
Okay, I want to tackle a couple more of these myths that you sort of outline in your book. This idea of the demure female.
Oh yeah.
And female sexuality as a whole. I think we're shifting away from this, but the idea that sex is strictly a male enterprise and women are recipients of sex, and they're strictly for childbearing.
Yeah.
Is that what you see in primates?
No. In biology, we have completely changed our tune on that. So in Victorian times, of course, that was the thing, is that and Darwin and many other biologists, they felt that men were the ones who wanted sex and sought sex, and women had to expect it and accept it, and that's how they looked at the world. And so a much more active sexuality for the male than for the female. This started to change when we did DNA testing. And so DNA testing on, for example, eggs of birds. Birds are so-called monogamous, songbirds. So you test the eggs of a songbird nest, and you find that some of the eggs are fertilized by a different male, who's not the male of the pair. And initially the biologists were confused by that and said, well, maybe the female has been raped by a male who came by. So that's the only explanation they could come up with. But now it turns out we know that these females actually go out of their way and make calls to call males to themselves who are not part of the pair. And so female sexuality, and certainly in the primates now we look at female sexuality as much more proactive, and that females have an interest actually having a lot of sexual partners. For example, in the birds, you can imagine for a bird it may be advantageous to have among her eggs some who are fertilized by other males, sort of spreading her risks by not having everything fertilized by the same male. And so we have evolutionary theories about why females are more proactive. We have now new ideas about the clitoris. The clitoris, 20 years ago, we had books that would say that the clitoris was just an accident. The clitoris had no function because females don't need sexual pleasure to get pregnant. Now we look very different at it. Is the clitoris of, for example, the bonobo has a very big clitoris. The dolphin has a very big clitoris. And both of these species, there's a lot of non-reproductive sex going on that the females engage in. And so the clitoris has a very important function, probably socially and sexually. Yeah.
So you mentioned that these species of birds, that you can infer that they're not strictly monogamous, and their behavior says otherwise. I can see why that would work among birds, but wouldn't that inspire like intra-male competition to know that? I don't know if primates are strictly monogamous, but I would imagine...
No, primates live in multi-male groups usually.
Okay.
So both chimpanzees and bonobos, they have no pair bond. That's a human thing. We have a family unit, male, female,
right.
children. That's a very human thing. In the primates, it's not very common. So the evolutionary explanation for a lot of proactive female sexuality in the primates is interesting. It comes from Sarah Hardy, an anthropologist, who thinks it has to do with infanticide. And so males will probably not kill infants of females they had sex with, because they could potentially be their own infants. So it would be very counterproductive for males to do that. The males don't know much about reproduction. They don't know about paternity. They don't know this is my kid or that is your kid. But if they would follow a rule, a simple rule that says, don't mess with females who you had sex with. Be kind to them. Be tolerant of them and their offspring. Then females have an interest to have sex with a lot of males, especially high-ranking males, because they are the dangerous ones. And so if they have sex with them, they exclude obnoxious behavior by these males. So that's a theory by Sarah Hardy.
Okay.
And there's quite a bit of evidence for that, is that the proactivity of female sexuality has to do with conflict avoidance and aggression avoidance. So a sort of safety measure, basically.
Right. I think that's a good strategy for female to employ, a female primate to employ. Are they looked upon less favorably by like their male counterparts for having multiple sexual partners? Or is that a discrete event?
That's a very human question. Because they really don't care.
Oh, they don't care. Okay.
So males may be jealous, of course. And a high-ranking male, if he sees a low-ranking male mate with a female, especially a female he's really interested in, of course he will go after the young male and chase him off. But it's not a reflection on the female, I think. And so in societies of bonobos and chimps, there is not a nuclear family. And so the males are not bonded in that sense to certain females. And whether a female has sex with 10 partners or just one partner, I don't think it matters much to them.
Okay, so the way humans solve that problem of male aggression, let's say, is through, I don't want to say enforced monogamy, but like a societal contract for monogamy. It's how we ensure paternity, and then that's how we kind of mitigate male aggression. Is that our solution to that problem?
Yeah, but it's also causing a problem.
Okay.
Because we humans, we tend to build houses and to live in these houses. And for example, during the COVID crisis, domestic violence has gone up everywhere.
Yes.
And that is because men and women are locked into a space where if the man is aggressive and abusive, the woman has no recourse. Her children are not going to help her, and all her friends and family are outside of the house. And so that creates a very dangerous situation for women. There's also much more rape in human society than in primate societies. In chimpanzees and bonobos. In chimpanzees, it's extremely rare to see rape. In bonobos, it's completely absent. So humans are a species that has created a situation where a man can protect a woman in the family unit and has a house to do so also. But he he himself can become a danger also. And so for women, it's extremely important to choose the right man, first of all.
Right.
And to have female friends or female family that can help her. So for example, in bonobos, the reason that there is no such abuse and rape is because the females help each other. In a species like the orangutan, which is quite solitary, and the females usually travel on their own, that's the only species of primate that I know in which rape is quite common. And that's the younger males, the adolescent males, who rape females. The females have no defenses because there's no one else around. So as soon as you get females in a sort of sisterhood where they support each other, they can put a halt to this kind of male behavior, and they do. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. So in primate societies, you say you virtually see no instances of rape, at least in these higher order primates.
Except in the orangutan, I think it's extremely rare. Yeah.
Exceedingly rare. And when you parallel that to human societies, rape is it is a prevalent occurrence among our human interactions.
Yeah, but also think the most common rape in human society is between acquaintances.
Right.
Because we always think it's a woman in the street who gets raped by somebody that she doesn't know. These things may happen, but that's not the typical. The typical pattern is within the family or within the relationships.
You're a primatologist, so maybe you don't have the answer to this question, but is the solution to implore something similar to that to our primate friends, like stronger networks?
The solution is female solidarity. Of course, another solution that we usually don't talk about is educating males to be respectful of females.
Right.
And so when I see there's a feminist, Gloria Steinem, who has said we need to raise boys more like girls to make them more sensitive and empathic and so on. We need to raise boys like girls. I think that is such nonsense, because I think boys are different. Sons are different things than daughters.
Correct.
And I'm from a family of 6 boys. And if there was one thing that my mother always repeated was respect women. You have to respect women. And I'm sure what she meant is you're going to be a man, you're going to be stronger than women, you're going to be more physically aggressive than women, and you should not use that against them. You should use that in a constructive way. And I think that's what boys need to learn, self-discipline and respect for women. So a boy needs to get different lessons in life than I think a girl gets.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there are very gendered problems that our society is trying to tackle, but they're trying to do it by getting rid of the concept of gender altogether, or moving into this like postmodern space where. Yeah,
that is I think non-productive. So you mentioned inequality. I am all for gender equality. I think when people talk about gender inequality, they focus on the wrong side of the problem. They focus on the gender, and they say, since we have gender inequality, we need to get rid of gender. I think we need to get rid of the inequality. You will never get rid of gender, and sex differences is just an impossibility, because we are a biological species. But inequality is something we can tackle. And I'm a primatologist. I'm not the one who gives concrete advice of how to do that. But by raising children differently, maybe one way of doing it. But it's the inequality and the injustice of it that we need to focus on. And at the moment in American society, we are sort of returning on old positions. I thought a lot of things had been solved with
right.
With our attitude to homosexuality and abortion and so on. And we're sort of returning to older positions. And I think it's extremely dangerous, and it will increase the inequality.
Fair. One last point that I want to cover with you. I think if I've got anything from your book, it was the point that you just sort of mentioned there, that we're sort of focusing on the wrong end of the argument there, and I think our culture needs to shift. So hopefully conversations with people like yourself can help move the needle a little bit in that direction. If you don't mind commenting on the mind-body dualism, I think that's also a function of this problem. It might be an even broader philosophical problem, but if you could just comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Yeah,
so I was surprised reading the early feminists like Simone de Beauvoir and so on. I was surprised to see that they take a very masculine slant on that. Is that the mind is the most important part, the body is the less important part. The bodies of men and women are mostly similar, except maybe for the genitals, but they're mostly similar. But we need to focus on the mind and intellectual achievement and intellectual development. And this focus on the mind, as opposed to the body, is such a masculine thing. For 2,000 years, male philosophers have told us that the mind is separate from the body. The flesh is weak, the body we can do away with, but the mind will always exist. And the white male mind, that's basically what they mean, is superior to everything else, is superior to what animals have, superior to what women have. Women are too close to their bodies in their sort of philosophy. And so that is such a masculine argument, and that's also why, for example, 99% of the people who want to freeze their brains are men. It's not women who want to freeze their brains.
Right.
It's men who think that they can put their brain in a box and freeze it, and 100 years later someone will open the box and get all their deep thoughts coming out. It's not going to happen, but that's what they think. And that's also why we had hermits, male hermits, who want to deny their body and deny food and deny women and live in a world purely of their mind. I think it's a very masculine thought. That the mind is separate from the body, even though we know that the mind is related to the brain and the brain is just part of your body. There's nothing separate about it. And so I was astonished that feminism had adopted that position to some degree, that the mind is more important than the body, and that all these biological processes can be denied or downplayed. And my book is largely directed at bringing biology back into the discussion. I think biology, and that's the body, biology needs to be brought back. And the last thing I want to say about that is that it is fairly easy for men to maybe think that their mind is separate from their body, because men don't go through cycles every month, which women do. Right. And so women are constantly subject to these hormonal fluctuations that occur, and the pregnancies, of course, and the nursing and the oxytocin release, and all of these changes are so familiar to women and unfamiliar to men. I think for men that position is easier to maintain, but it's a wrong position also for men. Men are also their bodies. They're not separate from their bodies.
I think that's a profound, like, scientific and sort of philosophical place to conclude this argument, is that we can't deny our bodies, but we are certainly agents of our own behavior. We're influenced by our culture and things beyond ourselves as well. But fundamentally, we are also informed upwards from our bodies. And I think your book does a really good job of telling that story. So I'd like to thank you for having you on my podcast. I want to say that you've been exceptionally easy, like logistically, and with all the other people I've been talking with. I messaged you a few months ago over email, and you didn't get back to me right away. I was in Toronto, and Jordan Peterson was on tour, and I was listening to him speak, and he had referenced.
I did a whole interview with him. Yeah.
I've seen it. I've seen it. And he was citing some of your work in his talk. And I turned over to my friend and I said, "Oh, you know the professor that he just mentioned? Well, I emailed him to be on my podcast," and he said no. You didn't say no, you just didn't respond. And I had followed up with you, and you were so gracious to me in making this work. And I just want to thank you for your time and all your contribution to the field and your public work as well. It's one thing to be an academic, but to also popularize, I think, important ideas is equally as important. So that scientific communication, thank you for all that.
Yeah.
While I still have you, so we've talked about sort of intra and intersexual relationships among primates. We've likened that to humans as well, but from my understanding, you're also involved in some of that human research, the intra and intersexual dynamic that takes place in the workplace. Is that where your research lies?
Yeah. So at the Emory Hospital, which we can see from here.
Yeah.
I had a postdoc, Laura Jones, who would go into operating rooms and sit in a little corner with a pad, an iPad, and type in data, the way we do for primates also. She was not allowed to video record the people, so it was all codified behavior. And we did that because an anesthesiologist in the hospital, he had told me he had read my book Chimpanzee Politics, and he said the operating room is like chimpanzee politics. He felt there was so much parallel between the power struggles that were going on between the anesthesiologist and the surgeon, or the surgeon and the head nurse, and he mentioned all these crises that occur and what happens in these operating rooms. And so we wanted to document that. And usually in an operating room, the alpha individual is the surgeon. And so
makes sense.
And they can be both genders nowadays. I think it's almost 50-50. Like, it can be male.
In surgery?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought my understanding was that in medicine broadly, it probably leans towards females, but specifically in surgery, I thought it was a male-dominated subspecialty, like among surgeons.
Yeah.
Like as an occupation. That was just my understanding.
No, I have to look up my study, but I think there was a lot of women there. So
oh, in the one, okay, right. In the one you published, yeah.
Yeah, the one that we published, there were a lot of women, not more than men, but there were a lot of women surgeons. And actually, one of the interesting things of that study that came out is that we could not tell from the behavior a gender difference between the surgeons. So the surgeon, whether it's a man or a woman, they behave exactly the same. The sort of data that we take is like who criticizes whom, who laughs with whom, who compliments whom, who asks for assistance, and how do you do it. So we had a lot of categories of behavior.
Right.
And the male surgeons and the female surgeons acted exactly the same.
So if I were to read those markers of behavior, I wouldn't be able to discriminate.
No.
Between male and female.
We did not expect that, but that's what we found.
Right.
So they're both acting like the top dog, clearly. And then we also found that all female teams, they are not so common, they do very well. That mixed teams do very well. All male teams are a bit boisterous. And so that happens sometimes, that you have an all-male team. There's a lot of rough behavior among them going on,
right,
that they probably tone down when there are women in the room. And so I think the most interesting finding that we had was that, because we were looking for conflict, when does conflict occur in the operating room, that if you have a male surgeon with a mostly female team, there's a high level of cooperation. If you have a female surgeon with a mostly male team, there's a high level of cooperation. The conflict occurs mostly when you have a male surgeon with a lot of men in the room, or a female surgeon with a lot of women in the room. And the explanation that I have for that as a primatologist is that for the alpha male, it's important what his status is among men. And for the alpha female, it's important what her status is among women. And that's why you get sometimes conflicts with the same gender people.
That is so interesting. So when you say these conflicts arise when there's more of a representation of one gender over the other, let's say, when you're saying they do well or they do poorly, do you mean like the harmony among the group, or do you mean like a clinical outcome? No, the harmony among the group. Okay.
We did not measure the clinical outcomes, so we measured the level of behavior, and surprisingly, the behavior in the operating room is extremely variable. People don't always realize that there's gossiping and laughing and dancing, and there's usually music going on, and so it's a microcosmos of society that's going on, and the patients, fortunately, they don't always know what's going on.
Fair.
But
it'd be concerning if they did.
Yeah, when people need to be for 10 hours in an operating room, of course they're not always paying attention necessarily to the task at hand. They also have other things that they talk about.
Right. Yeah. And I just want to specify, like, I know the answer to this, but you're not one for the conventional psychological measures of survey data and all this stuff. So what you're purporting here is based strictly on behavior. It's not like you went and asked the team, well, how do you feel the surgeon thought about you today?
That's the problem, is that if you ask people, let's say there is a conflict in the operating room, and you ask people, it's of course never their problem. It's somebody else's.
There you go.
Yeah, and that's why you cannot trust these data. So we wanted to do observational data. So study the operating room like a monkey group, basically. And I found this tension between the alpha individual and same gender co-workers. I found that interesting. That came out of that study. Yeah.
So between, let's say, the male alpha team member and then his partially female team, and then female alpha with mixed gender team, do either of them perform preferentially better, or is that like almost equivocal to each other?
You mean if the surgeon does better?
I meant like the team. Like, do they lead in different ways? Is the harmony different?
Yeah. There's a higher level of cooperation. So we measured. We had a sort of index of how much cooperation, how much conflict is there in the room.
Right.
And so the conflict goes down if you have an alpha with mostly members of the opposite gender. Yeah.
But does it matter which? My question is, does it matter which gender the alpha is, as long as the team members are opposite?
I think it was stronger for men, but male surgeons.
Okay.
But I'm not sure that there was a big difference there. Yeah.
Okay, so from that, what I can extrapolate is that within the workplace, a conflict mitigation tool, let's say, is to have intersex teams. I guess across the board, it doesn't even matter necessarily who's the top dog, if you will.
Yeah. But I had the article, one of the reviewers was an anthropologist.
Okay.
And she works with people in New Guinea. She usually works with people, non-Western people. And she said to me that that's only possible that these mixed gender teams do so well if you have rules for male behavior. So what she meant is that if the men are obnoxious or aggressive or sexually abusive, then that whole cooperation is going to fall apart.
Oh, I see.
And she said this only works if you have cultural rules like we have in our society nowadays.
Right.
That men have to behave in certain ways. So she because she was comparing it, of course, with the people that she knows, and she doesn't think it would work the same way there.
Oh, I see what you mean. It would be interesting to sort of repeat that type of observational study in a different environment, because I imagine people working in an operating room are highly educated, highly civilized. They probably had access to the most resources throughout their entire life. They have a certain decorum to them, right?
Yeah.
And social understanding. So perhaps there's merit to her argument.
About cultural differences. A funny thing happened is that the study was reviewed in some sort of German magazine, and I read German, and so this was a German professor who was claiming we never have conflicts in the operating room. We in Germany, we never have conflicts in the operating room. And I know that these conflicts occur everywhere. In Japan, in Holland, everywhere I go, I hear that there are sometimes conflicts in the operating room.
Right.
But this German, he thought they were non-existent, which would be very surprising.
Oh, he just dismissed the phenomenon altogether?
He was totally in denial, I think, about it. Or maybe he was a surgeon himself and didn't see the conflicts, because they don't always see what they do.
Fair enough. No, I think that's amazing that we can draw that insight from that work environment.
In the Netherlands, I know for sure that some clinics had been closed for a couple of weeks because there was too much conflict going on.
Oh, it gets that.
Yeah, and
that
I
bad,
bet that happens in Canada also sometimes. Even though the Canadians are so polite and friendly.
No, you don't want it to push us the wrong way. We bite back, but fair enough. Yeah, in such a stressful environment, you still see that. The intersexual dynamic come out and reduce conflict, which is probably a surprising outcome for most people to hear.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Are you doing anything else like that, or?
No, this was a one-time human study that we did.
Oh, okay. Well, I hope your colleagues continue that type of work. Very, very interesting.
Okay.
All right, we'll call it there.